The aftermath of the 9/11 attacks spawned dozens of various theories that offered alternative explanations to the official story. So enraged are family members of victims that they have spent years of their lives trying to get to the truth of what actually happened that day. Many people of note that read the official report that was issued found it to be full of holes and ineffective at best. Aside from the fact that never before in history have we seen a steel-framed skyscraper collapse due to fire, which is what happened to WTC-7, a 47-story skyscraper that was the third building to collapse in Manhattan that day, a collapse that was, by the way, reported on by the BBC before it even occurred. How would they know that was going to happen if it was a historical precedent?
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
There are still many other glaring anomalies which have not been explained by the official story. Casting aside evidence of nanothermite, a military-grade incendiary, that would have had to have been planted in the buildings before the attacks occurred, and which would explain the explosions and/or subsequent collapse in a much more plausible way than the plane's impact.
There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams. When I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall.
Casting aside actual footage that seems to show explosive squibs coming out of the sides of the buildings as they collapsed, casting aside for a moment the testimonials of first responders who said that an explosion went off in the lobby.
What happened?
We was in an explosion. We was in the lobby and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible.
It's like hell. You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
Casting aside a document by a group called PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which openly called for a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor to justify expansion of military operations in the Middle East. Casting aside the fact that George W. Bush seemed completely unfazed at the news of the attack while he was sitting in a classroom with an upside-down copy of a book called My Pet Goat, all pertinent and intriguing facts.
Read these words the fast way. Get ready.
Play.
Yes, playing. Get ready.
Must.
Yes, must. Let's read these words the fast way without making a mistake. Get ready.
Kite.
Yes, kite. Get ready.
Kit.
Yes, kit. Get ready.
Steal.
Yes, steal. Get ready.
Plane.
Yes, playing. Get ready.
Must.
Yes, must. Go to your speaker reader up from under your seat. Open your book up to lesson 60 on page 153.
There were actually live drills conducted just before 9/11, simulating hijackings of airliners and a large-scale terrorist attack in the United States. This is one of the reasons NORAD had a problem and stood down, because they were confused as to whether or not what was happening that day was still part of the exercise or whether it was a real situation.
Hi, Boston Center Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys to... We need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
A similar occurrence took place on 7/7 in London. Peter Powers, a man who was part of a terrorism exercise being conducted simulating bombings at train stations, said this on the radio shortly after the attack.
Because at 9:30 this morning, we were actually running an exercise for over a company of 1,000 people in London, based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations that happened this morning. So I still have the hairs on the back of my neck standing upright.
To get this quite straight, you were running an exercise to see how you would cope with this, and it happened while you were running the exercise?
Precisely.
Drills often seem to precede these events. One such drill occurred late last year. Called Event 201, it was a simulation of a worldwide pandemic involving, you guessed it, coronavirus. The exercise was run by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It used nomenclature such as flood the zone, referring to the need to heavily control the flow of information given to the world's populations so they aren't misled by conspiracy theories and/or fake news. A skeptic might say, well, these people are experts, and they're obviously using their expertise to help the world prepare for the inevitable, and look, they were right, it happened. Well, that's one way of looking at it. If we look at the history of outbreaks over the past few years, we'll see a strange pattern. There is always some sort of outbreak scare during an election cycle. Given the constant attacks on President Trump from the media and establishment at large over the past 3 years, in many ways due to his anti-globalist stance and vocal opposition to some elements of intelligentsia and the establishment, is it not at least possible that such an event that has done immense damage to the economy of the United States and the world could be some sort of design to damage the progress that his administration has made, while simultaneously supporting the notion that world government, heightened control of populations, and consolidation of information dissemination is necessary? Considering the virus came from China, within miles of a Bio-Level 4 lab that handles and experiments on such pathogens, what are the odds that Dr. Fauci, a man who is knee-deep in globalist ventures, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a man who has been embroiled in scandals in the past regarding the HIV virus, and who visited the said lab in Wuhan with the previous president, a vocal opponent of Donald Trump's, would make this statement a couple of years ago?
Is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, and we have certainly a large burden of that, but also there will be a surprise outbreak.
Another interesting piece of information that has come to the forefront is this study titled Hypoxia Downregulates Protein S Expression. The study, published in July 2018, describes how hypoxia, a low concentration of oxygen, decreases protein S in the blood, a natural anticoagulant. This leads to an increased risk for the development of thrombosis or blood clots, some of which are potentially life-threatening. Hypoxia also leads to fatigue, headaches, nausea, cognitive impairment, low energy levels, and decreased immunity, thus creating mass damage to the population. Meanwhile, many jurisdictions continue to roll out mask mandates, despite the fact that a recent CDC study even concluded that masks were ineffective and offered no significant reduction in influenza transmission. Additionally, mask mandates continue to violate workplace guidelines, such as OSHA standards in the US, which state allowable oxygen levels for employees must be at or above 19.5% at all times. From the study, because protein S is primarily produced in the liver, the team of researchers cultured human hepatocarcinoma cells at normal oxygen and also hypoxic conditions, and then measured levels of the protein. They found that increasing hypoxia not only reduced PS, but also significantly increased a protein that turns on the gene to produce hypoxia. This suggested that the protein, hypoxia-inducing factor 1, might regulate protein S, which the researchers confirmed through biochemical and genetic approaches in a mouse model. The study found that the level of protein S dropped by 50% when O2 levels were at 15% instead of the normal 21%. A very well-cited article by the Oregon dissenter entitled "The Lethal Link Between Masks, Hypoxia and Blood Clots" extrapolates this research and explains the implications. Just a 5% drop in blood oxygenation is considered abnormal, but a 15% reduction will cause noticeable symptoms. These include headaches, dizziness, nausea, and cognitive impairment. Even surgeons can suffer low O2 and associated symptoms merely from wearing a surgical mask. At sea level, the air we breathe is 21% oxygen. High altitude, where pilots can suffer ill effects, begin at even 5,000 feet. The N95 mask, commonly worn, eclipses that elevation. It's well known to cause a 20% reduction in O2, which simulates the 16% O2 of 6,000 feet. As the N95 simulates a similarly low oxygen saturation, this indicates wearing a mask may decrease your natural ability to prevent blood clots by 50%. This has potentially serious implications. A web search for blood clot COVID returns many stories about the virus-induced blood clotting and its lethality for those patients. In June, researchers in Utah discovered that platelet hyperactivity is a cause of COVID-19 clotting. Meanwhile, take a look at this new study, Neuropharmaceutical Measures for Pandemic Influenza in Non-Healthcare Settings, Personal Protective and Environmental Measures, approved by the WHO, World Health Organization, and CDC, Center for Disease Control, published on the CDC's website, where it states the study was conducted in preparation for the development of guidelines by the World Health Organization on the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions for pandemic influenza in non-medical settings. This was a study specifically set up during the COVID pandemic. The conclusion? Masks are not effective. I will quote straight from the study. In our systematic review, we identified 10 RCTs, random controlled trials, that reported estimates of the effectiveness of face masks in reducing laboratory-confirmed influenza virus infections in the community, from literature published during 1946 through to July 27, 2018. In pooled analysis, we found no significant reduction in influenza transmission with the use of face masks. There is limited evidence for their effectiveness in preventing influenza virus transmission, either when worn by the infected person for source control or when worn by an uninfected person to reduce exposure. Our systematic review found no significant effect of face masks on transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. Now, while none of these slices of evidence or circumstance are proof of anything on their own, the culmination of such facts together lead one to at least in some way form a suspicion that something is amiss. The question often asked when it comes to these large conspiracy theories is, okay then, who is doing it? Who are they? Why are they doing it? Motive, after all, is an important element in solving crime. When we look at the results of events like 9/11 and more recently this pandemic, the common thread between them in terms of outcome is the increase in control and/or loss of civil liberties and freedoms. The fear created by such occurrences gives a certain latitude to the powers that be to exercise more control over their populations in order to protect them. From the threat of terrorism, which not only set the precedent for billions of dollars of investment into technologies that fatten the coffers of defense contractors and technology and security companies, to the now billions being poured into big pharma and vaccine research, money and control have always been prime motivators for criminal conspiracy. When a crime occurs, say a murder, the detective doesn't dismiss the occurrence of the crime just because he doesn't know who committed it. He instead looks for motive, opportunity, and collects whatever evidence he can to help divulge who, what, where, when, and how. A document by the Rockefeller Foundation, titled Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development, written in May 2010, outlines a number of scenarios that use what they call predetermined elements to predict the future. The document cites on page 13. For example, it is a near geopolitical certainty that with the rise of China, India, and other nations, a multipolar global system is emerging. One demographic certainty is that global population growth will continue and will put pressure on energy, food, and water resources, especially in the developing world. Another related certainty that the world will strive to source more of its energy from renewable resources and may succeed, but there will likely still be a significant level of global interdependence on energy. The scenarios use another set of factors called uncertainties, one being called global political and economic alignment, and the other adaptive capacity. The first is pretty much what it sounds like. On one end of the axis, we would see a more integrated global economy with high trade volumes which enable access to a wider range of goods and services through imports and exports and the increasing specialization of exports. We would also see more cooperation at the supranational level, fostering increased collaboration, strengthened global institutions, and the formation of effective international problem-solving networks, like the Rockefeller Foundation itself. At the other access endpoint, the potential for economic development in the developing world would be reduced by the fragility of the overall global economy, coupled with protectionism and fragmentation of trade, along with a weakening of governance regimes that raise barriers to cooperation, thereby hindering agreement on and implementation of large-scale interconnected solutions to pressing global challenges. That's key. The second uncertainty, adaptive capacity, essentially refers to how society will cope with change to external forces. They iterate that high levels of adaptive capacity are achieved through the existence of trust in society, the presence of diversity, the free flow of communication and ideas, and strength of institutions. When we look at their diagram, we see 4 scenarios at play across these axes. The scenario I want to talk about today is the one titled lockstep, which results from low adaptive capacity, those things I just mentioned, and strong political and economic alignment. Remember, this was written in 2010 and mentions that it's making predictions for a period of time in 10 to 20 years. Here's the first part of the lockstep scenario. In 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain, originating from wild geese, was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked across the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers. The pandemic blanketed the planet. Though disproportionate numbers died in Africa, hasn't happened in this case due to the regular use of hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malaria drug. Southeast Asia and Central America, where the virus spread like wildfire in the absence of official containment protocols. But even in developed countries, containment was a challenge. The United States' initial policy of strongly discouraging citizens from flying, deadly in its leniency, accelerating the spread of the virus not just within the US but across borders. However, a few countries did far better. China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling swifter post-pandemic recovery. In this real-world scenario, this didn't happen. China did lock down its internal borders, but they kept external borders open for some time, allowing the virus to spread internationally, something that the media has failed to address. The consequence of this, of course, was a lengthened pandemic, which further increases the justification for extended lockdowns. Back to the scenario. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at entrances to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, the more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasing global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. At first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms: biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter restrictions of key industries. And it goes on. Just recently here in Victoria, Australia, the entire Greater Melbourne area has been placed under Stage 4 restrictions with an evening curfew for 6 weeks. The average death rates for influenza in Australia are 1,500 to 3,000 a year. Lockstep. A more controlled world. I find it interesting that in the few years before this pandemic, there has been a seemingly coordinated effort to push society into the directions required to make this scenario a reality. Strong political and economic alignment, created through globalization, erosion of national sovereignty, along with an erosion of adaptive capacity through the bifurcation of society into tribalism, the destruction of faith in institutions, and the reduction of the free flow of information through censorship, particularly views that conflict with the ideas of globalization and the erosion of national sovereignty. Here's something David Rockefeller once said.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.